Hey, and welcome back to Heimler's History. In the last video, we started talking about Unit 5 of AP World History by talking about the Enlightenment, and in that movement, the thinky people of Europe introduced some very provocative ideas into the world that had some massive political consequences. And we're going to look at those specific consequences in this video, namely nationalism and political revolution. So, if you're ready, I'm ready, let's get to it. So let's start with some revolution. Now, if you watched the last video on the Enlightenment, you may remember that some of the most consequential teachings of the Enlightenment had to do with natural rights and the social contract. Our buddy John Locke described natural rights as those rights that are given human beings by God, which is to say, not the government. And for Locke, those rights were life, liberty, and property. And if that's true, then that means that human beings are in a social contract with their government. So the social contract means that the power to rule is by nature in the hands of the people, and that means that they willingly give over some of that power to a government who in turn protects their natural rights. And so as a result of all this teaching, people started getting the idea that governments ought to protect their rights, and governments ought to run by democratic processes, and governments ought to be constitutional in nature. Those ideas started taking hold all over the world, and the first place they really took hold and caused a revolution was in the British colonies of North America. The American Revolution occurred for many reasons, not least of which was that over time, the colonies had grown functionally independent of the British Crown. I mean, first of all, there was a giant ocean separating the colonies from the motherland. Second of all, the colonies grew increasingly suspicious of the Crown because although the colonists had precisely no representation in the British Parliament, the government kept levying taxes on the colonists, and these taxes were becoming more and more odious. And so on July 4th, 1776, the British colonies of America declared their independence and became the United States of America. Ooh, baby, am I the only one who wants to high-five a bald eagle right now? Now, this is important because the Declaration of Independence, penned by our good buddy Thomas Jefferson, was positively suffused with Enlightenment thinking, namely John Locke's Enlightenment thinking. Let me give you an example. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. There's the natural rights doctrine. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And that right there is the social contract. And it was surely not a foregone conclusion that these fledgling colonies in the Americas would actually win against the British Empire. But with a little help from the French, that's exactly what they did. And by 1783, the United States of America was officially outside of the thumb of the British Empire and were a nation of their own. Now, the American Revolution provided inspiration for another revolution that occurred only a few years later, namely the French Revolution. So by the 1780s, France was like shoulders deep in economic woes, mainly caused by war spending. And in order to solve that problem, King Louis XVI called in 1789 a meeting of the Estates General. And the Estates General was an official body that represented the three estates of the French population, namely the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. And even though the third estate represented like 98% of the population, they still had an equal vote with the other two estates, the clergy and the nobility, which really only represented about 2% of the population. Now, the third estate may have been less educated, but they could do that kind of math, and what that kind of math told them was that the other two estates were taking a representative dump on them. So, as a result, the third estate broke away and formed their own representative body called the National Assembly, and when Louis XVI heard about such insolence, he threatened to arrest the leaders of the National Assembly, and in response to that, on July 14th, 1789, an angry crowd stormed the Bastille, which was a prison that, in the eyes of the people, symbolized monarchical abuse and the corruption of the aristocracy. And this fervor spread throughout France, inciting peasants from all over to rise up against their nobles. The result of all this was significant. Louis XVI was forced to accept a new governmental arrangement that gave significant voice to the National Assembly. And out of all this, a new document was produced, and wouldn't you know it, that document's cup runneth over with Enlightenment thought. It was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and it was deeply influenced by the American Declaration of Independence and included protections of basic human rights and provided for a limited monarchy. Now, that last part, as you can imagine, was not favorable to Louis XVI. He fought against it, and that initiated a period of the French Revolution called the Reign of Terror, which culminated in the beheading of the king. Now, across the sea, France had a colony in a little island called Haiti, and that's where our third revolution occurred. Now, this colony, in terms of population, was mainly made up of two different groups of people. There were a few French plantation owners, and then there was a huge population of enslaved Africans who were working for the plantation owners. And so as the National Assembly back in France flooded the streets yelling out liberty and they're beheading kings because they deserve freedom from tyranny, the slave population in Haiti is like, yeah, those seem like some pretty good ideas, bruh. And so the enslaved population of Haiti rose up in revolution against their masters and killed many of them and burned their houses as well. In 1791, a Haitian named Toussaint Louverture took charge and led the rebellion against the French enslavers. And much like the American Revolution, it was altogether surprising when the Haitians actually clinched a victory against the French and established an independent Haitian government. It was the first successful revolution of enslaved people and the first black-led independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. Now, so far, most of these revolutions have had happy endings, but that is not always the case. And that was true in the case of the New Zealand Wars. So the British annexed New Zealand in 1840 and established dominance over the natives, which were known as the Maori. And as is the case with almost every colonial endeavor that we've studied in this course, the natives of New Zealand did not take kindly to being ruled by foreign whiteys. And so the Maori tribes joined together in order to fight against the British and expel them from their land. But by 1872, the British had crushed the rebellion and clamped down even tighter on the Maori. The final revolution we're going to consider happened over in Latin America. Now, recall from the last unit that when Europeans introduced themselves into the Americas, it created a completely new social hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy were the Peninsulares, who were those who were born in Europe. Under them were the Creoles, and they were like the B-grade Europeans because they were Europeans, but they were born in the Americas. And so with a growing awareness of revolutions that are occurring throughout the world and the profusion of Enlightenment thought into their daily lives, the Creoles began thinking of revolting themselves. Now, the Creoles were discontent for a few reasons. First, many Creoles were extraordinarily wealthy because of their agricultural pursuits, but because of the mercantilist policies of Spain, they were losing a huge chunk of their profits. And the second reason Creoles were discontent is because they were often passed over for positions of authority which were summarily reserved for Peninsulares. And so, under the leadership of Simon Bolivar, the Creoles rose up against Spain. He was extraordinarily successful and gained a huge chunk of territory that he called Gran Colombia. And this movement, too, had a document that outlined its values, and those values were shot through with Enlightenment thought. In Bolivar's letter from Jamaica, he argued for the necessity of constitutional republics, of natural rights, and for democratic ideals in the governing of the people of Latin America. Okay, those are the big revolutions occurring during this time period, but there's also something at the core of all these revolutions that all of them share, and that is a sense of nationalism. In case you forgot, nationalism is like a force that binds people together who share the same ethnic identity and language. And when people start feeling that, they often long to be united under a single political unit. And so the last thing we need to talk about in this video is how nationalism led to the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany. And these unifications weren't really revolutions, but they did draw energy from the same sources. So let's begin with Italian unification. So since the fall of Rome many centuries before, the Italian peninsula had been divided into independent and competing states. So in 1848, the prime minister of one of those states, by the name of Count Cavour, led the charge to unify Italy under his house, the House of Savoy. Now, since this house was the only native Italian dynasty, it only made sense to him that the entire nation ought to be united under his rule. And long story short, through strategic alliances and battles, he was able to unite Italy. And German unification was somewhat similar. In 1848, the Prussian leader Otto von Bismarck engineered 3 wars that united the German people in spirit against the enemy. And in 1871, he united them in a nation when he founded the new unified German Empire. Alright, that's what you need to know about revolutions and nationalism for Unit 5 of AP World History. If you feel an identification with the people of the Heimler Nation, then let us unify under the banner of Heimler's history and subscribe. If you want this video to cause a revolution in history learning on YouTube, then hit the like button and watch it take over. If you want to help support this channel and get all the benefits of citizenship in the Heimler Nation, then go on over to Patreon and join the generous folks who keep this channel going. Heimler out.